over at Joyce's. I'm not at Joyce's, Mom. I don't even know the rest of it.
What movie is that?
Just Friends.
Just Friends. That's a Christmas classic, and has absolutely nothing to do with this episode.
Other than his name is Chris. Our guest today is Chris Wilson, who is a colleague-ish of Tony's.
Nah, not really.
Previously?
He's kind of just he's done some things here and
Tony's met him through professional channels, and they do some work together. And Chris has a background in what I thought was trauma-informed care, which it is, but it's much more extensive than that. So we originally went to talk with Chris about trauma, just generally, which is a huge thing to try to do in an hour. We were not originally trying to be his patients, and then he became our therapist. So I think we're splitting Chris's into two because we went in for an hour and we ended up staying for 2 hours. And the first half was really talking about his experience and his careers and how things have shifted and where he's at now. And then through some trust and self-disclosure, we ended up having a totally different conversation just about our own personal experiences with trauma and traumatic relationships, whether they were romantic or if they were family. So we dove into that. So I think this one's going to be split into two because it's A, too long, and B, they're two related but different topics. So.
Yeah. It was a powerful conversation, what it turned into, and it was, I think, a very vulnerable conversation as well, but also just go into this one with the understanding that some of the topics that we talk about are very sensitive. So Chris is a retired clinical psychologist, so he talks about experiences of working with abusive men, experiences of working with their abused partners, so the victims, and some of that is it's very raw. So just go into it with that understanding, if that's something that you're comfortable listening to.
Interestingly, too, he worked. Another one of his careers was working in, I think it was like a women's correctional facility, and through his work with the women that are in prison, he found that there are so many of them that are victims of their own experiences with abuse, and they are in there because of reactions to abuse or, a lifelong experience with abuse, and that led them down certain paths. So it goes a couple different ways, and it's all incredibly interesting. But like Tony said, while Chris is a licensed mental health professional and I'm licensed in Illinois as a mental health professional, none of it is mental health advice or suggestions. So I appreciate that there's a trigger warning on these. It's nothing super, super heavy, but any talk about trauma and traumatic experiences can cause a lot of reactions.
Enjoy the conversation with Dr. Chris Wilson. I am super excited to introduce Dr. Chris Wilson to the Tell Us More About That podcast. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Tony and Jen. It's great to be here.
Did you pick this question?
So this is, we didn't give you a heads up on this, but so every guest we start by asking a random question from a random game that we found in our entertainment center in the living room. We'll kick it off with a question.
Is this one on top? Because you
bring it on.
Go for it.
No.
You gonna shuffle them, or are you just picking from the top?
I didn't like the top question.
All right. Okay.
Shuffle.
Okay. Shuffle.
Hopefully something comes up that's trauma informed.
That'd be a weird.
God, hopefully not, given that that's what we're going to talk about.
What is the funniest advice that your mother ever gave you?
Oh my God, the funniest advice. Oh, wow, that's a head scratcher.
That is.
I'm trying to think of all the advice my mom has given me because the list is long. I mean, if we're being totally transparent, I don't think my mom ever gave me advice that was like funny or like she's done some pretty funny things, but I don't know that she's ever given me advice that I went like, "Oh, Mom,
I wonder if there's something else in here. Is there any advice
Here, let me see. There was a
from
good
mom
one in
that sticks out in general? Funny, important?
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because at some point we'll talk about this book that I'm writing, and part of the writing was remembering. So this is a book about apologies, and part of the writing was remembering the first time I remember having to apologize, and what the advice or the learning that my mom passed on about always look someone in the eye, say you're sorry and mean it, and then don't do it again. Mm-hmm. And I had stolen a candy bar from the Andova candy shop.
Damn it, Chris.
I know, right? And that's probably the first piece of sort of advice that I remember her giving me.
That third piece of don't ever do it again. I think a lot of people don't get that advice in life.
And we'll talk about it when we get around to it. But part of why I think what I am hoping to bring to the table when it comes to apologies is that little bit, because it's in some ways it's sort of unreasonable for certain things. I think for stealing candy bars, that's a reasonable.
Seems reasonable.
Sure.
All right,
but for things like hurting people's feelings or
yeah,
saying things that you wish you hadn't said, we're human. We're going to continue to
learn.
Chevy Lee.
All right, so we got Chris Wilson with us. Chris, we've now gotten to know each other. Now you and Jen know each other. Can you do an introduction for anyone outside of the three of us?
Sure. I'm a retired psychologist. I started my career working with abusive men and ran groups for them for 10 years. I also worked in a women's prison for 7 years, both running groups, doing individual work, and doing intake assessments with them. And I then transitioned into a private practice that was a combination of both clinical work, individual work, as well as doing forensic evaluations, usually in civil cases involving the Department of Human Services. And then every now and then would do work for a defense attorney and would do an evaluation on their client to give them a sense of whether their client has been upfront with them, let's just say. And these were all individuals who were dealing with criminal cases involving abuse, and the defense attorneys usually wanted to know, am I going to be surprised by something? And 10 times out of 10, every time I ended up sharing information with them that they were like, oh, goodness gracious.
Is it
so?
Not to get off on a tangent, but I'm interested in that. So would you go in and have a session with their client and get them to disclose all the secrets in their closets?
Yeah, so sort of by way of continued introduction for the audience, Tony and I and your prior guest, Colton Seal, were writing this interview on relational interviewing. And this is the power of relational interviewing. Defense attorneys would send me their clients. We would sit down and really just have a conversation. They would end up sharing with me abusive incidents. In some cases, it was other criminal activity. And so I would inevitably call back the defense attorney and say, hey, here's what your client shared. And because of the fact their clients were always sharing information that defense did not want the prosecutors to know, I never wrote a report. They called them pocket evaluations, which means the attorney just took the evaluation, put it in their pocket, and it was never seen from or heard from again. Wow. So it was more to assist the attorney in making sense of who was sitting in front of them. I never did any psych testing or cognitive testing. It was just an interview that led to a lot of disclosure, and it was all relational based.
Was some of that for the strategy so that they weren't surprised on the stand if something that was the whole thing?
All of it was. Yeah. All of it was.
So the individual that you were speaking with, they knew essentially an indirect way of telling them you have absolute immunity here. There's nothing that's going to happen. And so you heard some crazy shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the fascinating thing about it is, for whatever reason, they hadn't told their attorney these things. The attorneys were often really surprised. because I think, each of the attorneys that would work with me were probably quite good interviewers in their own right. So I don't know why these folks would disclose what they disclosed, other than to say that I think it had to do with the relational style of the interviewing and that protection. Although I think, Colton would say suspects and subjects tell you crazy things that they shouldn't tell you, even when they don't have the protection of client-attorney privilege. Attorney-client privilege. Yeah.
I actually didn't. I knew that there was a strategy involved, like on the back end, with the attorneys to kind of get out all the secrets, so that you could strategize and plan for some of those things if they were to surface. But I didn't know that they had psychologists that would come in and like have those conversations, and those wouldn't be technically discoverable, and you could just strategize and not use them in any other formal capacity. That's wild.
At some point, I decided I don't want to do this anymore. I had been doing training since before I went to graduate school and loved it. Workshops. My mom, one of my earliest memories as a kid is going to a stress reduction workshop with my mom and having her ask me to demonstrate in front of this room of who knows how many adults how to do a full body scan relaxation exercise. And I was probably 7 years old. And
oh my gosh.
It was I thought it was the coolest thing ever. So at some point I decided I wanted to try to make this transition. And I actually hired a coach who had been a former student of mine when I was a teaching assistant in my graduate program. And we got reconnected, and his name's Robert Biswas-Diener. He's just fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. And so we set up a plan for me to transition out of doing the forensic work, doing the clinical work, and into doing full-time training and consultation. And it was probably 3-4 years later, around 2000, I think it was 2019, 2020, that I was full-time training and completely closed my clinical practice. It might have been a little before that.
What made you decide to shift gears in your career?
My own trauma history was getting triggered way too often.
Okay.
And I remember in one of my sessions with my own therapist, she said, you don't have to do this work. And I was like,
what a reminder.
I was like, really? So it was not an easy decision, and it's why I hired a coach to assist with the transition, because as you can imagine, it was pretty freaking stressful.
So, I mean, in your private practice, you were struggling with your own personal experience with trauma and also trying to help support others experiencing their own.
Yeah.
Was it hard for you to sit with empathy and also not take it on as your own?
No, it was more about exhaustion. I was just getting overloaded. I wouldn't say that I was having flashbacks, or I wouldn't. Now, well, the one thing I would say is it was hard for me not to talk about what I was going through. You can't ever really talk about what your clients tell you, right? But you can talk about it as the therapist with, my significant other and with my mom, who's also a therapist, just the struggle I was having with staying motivated. And the biggest thing, I was exhausted, and I was starting to get avoidant. I was starting to not look forward to going in and doing a session and seeing clients and or writing up a report or
Sounds like you had all the precursors of burnout that we just talked about.
Well, and it's so fascinating to me that that you had somebody talking about burnout, because in my mind, it was not burnout. It was vicarious trauma. And I draw like a real hard line distinction with burnout being, and I don't know if your person described this way, but burnout, like being overwhelmed by the demands of the job and you don't have the support to meet those demands. Vicarious trauma, you literally have symptoms of PTSD based on your exposure to other people's traumas. And I was definitely over here on the symptoms of PTSD consistent with the exposure that I was getting.
He kind of defined burnout as more of a holistic relational definition between the employer and the employee, and not making it all encompassing on like you're just sick of the job. It's also like what variables could your company, agency, organization be doing to better support you. But the symptoms were very similar to what you're talking about, like just waking up exhausted and having zero motivation to go in, and questioning your purpose and your identity and the role, and like kind of all these things that it's none of it's completely siloed. There's a lot of transference, I'm sure, but
and you could throw compassion fatigue in there as well.
Yeah.
Burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. I think if you looked at the symptoms, they're probably all very, very similar. I think it's the causes that are different.
If you're the organization you work for or the industry that you work within, they can only do so much to support you. And if the work that you're doing is causing vicarious trauma in yourself, then yes, I mean, you can do as much trauma work for yourself, but that still exists. And to be reminded of it daily while you're in this position of helping and guiding and supporting, that can only last for so long.
You know, it's super interesting. I did. So on the side, I do some. I'm a former sports photographer, so I do some photo work. I do some video work, and I was doing a video for my spouse's nonprofit, and it was on resilience. And at the time, the term self-care was like really big. And so I was interviewing this advocate who was a friend of ours. Her name's Susan Moen. And I remember saying, you know, Susan, what are your favorite self-care techniques? And she said, I don't like that word. I'm not willing to talk about it in terms of self-care. And I was like, what are you talking about? I don't get it. And it was this huge revelation for me. She was like, I think we need to talk about it from the perspective of what your past guest said, that this is a relationship between the organization and the individual. And when you call it self-care, you put it all on the individual. And the organization can say, well, you need to do more self-care, as opposed to when you talk about resilience, you can talk about, well, what is the organization doing to support your resilience? And so an example she used was one of her resilience practices was taking naps in the middle of the day, and her boss had given her permission to put a sign up on her door that said 15-minute resilience break. And she would go take a 15-minute nap in the middle of the day. And it was so helpful to her.
That's great.
I love that.
Isn't that neat?
When I was in private practice, one of the kind of weekly expectations, and my clinical director would regularly in our supervision check in and ask if I was doing them, is an hour of self-care during your working hours. And I am so, I don't want to say triggered by the term self-care, but I cannot stand the term self-care. We talk about it all the time.
The goal to ask you that, knowing
I know.
Like you had 8 clients back to back, like, are you going to slide in an hour there?
Right.
Knowing you won't get paid for that hour?
Absolutely
like, oh
not.
my gosh.
But the term self-care, and we talked about this after we talked with Colton too, just one-on-one, was I had always viewed burnout as this personal failure, this personal inability. And so talking with Colton, it was like this light bulb moment of, because I couldn't ever figure it out. Like, I can do these things. I'm competent. I'm capable. Like, why does this job feel so challenging? And it was because it was missing this relational piece. And that was a huge shift for me. But if I had one more person be like, well, what are you doing for self-care? I was going to lose it.
Yeah. Well, that was what Susan said. Susan said the same thing. She's like, it just puts all the responsibility on the individual. And she's like, it's just, you know, she's very intelligent. She's like, it's not fair. And B, it's not accurate.
Yeah.
You know, in an organization that supports their people, it's about resilience, and resilience is relational and community based. And and for folks with trauma histories, you know, you think about somebody who's had a traumatic experience. So much of the meaning making that we do is related to why didn't I? And so you build into your brain this cognitive neural network, this belief set of when things don't go the way that you would like them to, instead of looking at the whole picture, we very often personalize. Why didn't I? Why didn't I? And that's not to say that it's a bad idea to have a contemplative practice of, what was my role and what. But I think for a lot of survivors of trauma, that why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? Why am I not doing a better job of taking care of myself? It just becomes a vicious cycle that an organization can unwittingly then take advantage of. And you see it a ton in advocacy organizations. And you also now, I think, are seeing a real push from advocacy organizations to try to be more responsible, more relational, and more supportive from a resilience perspective, as opposed to what are you doing for your self-care? Because you're not alone, Jen. I've done so many trainings where when I say we're not going to talk about self-care today, we're going to talk about resilience. You just see people's faces go, oh, thank God. Yeah.
That's okay. So you started with this idea of what you thought you wanted to be and what you wanted to do. You went after it. You achieved it. You got into the practice, and then you started getting hit in the face with the reality of how it's actually affecting you. And I'm setting it up like this because this is a pattern. I feel like we talk to so many people, regardless of the profession that they're in. And we talked to Colton about this a little bit also. But two things that I want to kind of get your insight on with that path of the identity crisis, which creates the stress of I invested all my time, all my money, all of my attention into being a practicing psychologist. And maybe you thinking to yourself, I can't do it. Or it's not for me. What am I supposed to do? So that first trigger of the stress and how that probably makes it exponentially more challenging. But then the secondary piece of this, so I'm asking you a bad question because there's too many questions in the question, but did you have any type of direction or insight before you dove in as to what this might be like once you get into it?
What's this?
This was the part of the job as a practicing clinical psychologist. Did you have any capacity to understand that this may be something that I may not be able to do?
No, absolutely none. No, I was convinced that this was for me. In particular, the running groups. When I was in graduate school, we all do our clinicals where you get your internship and you do individual therapy and you get supervision and you watch tape. And I was one of the few people in my program that started out doing group supervision, meaning running groups and then being supervised. Normally, you had to wait until your second year of graduate school. I was granted permission to get supervision and start running groups in my first year because I'd already done so much group work, both in residence life and housing and then in some other places before I got to graduate school. And they needed male co-therapists.
Yeah, okay.
Right? Everybody that wanted to run groups was a woman, and they needed male. They wanted gender-balanced teams, and so I had this super unique opportunity. So I left graduate school going, I want to run groups. And when I found a job running groups with abusive men, my initial reaction was, well, I'd rather work at McDonald's than run groups for abusive men. That just sounds horrible. But my boss ended up being this guy who was incredibly creative, groundbreaking, did not do the traditional psychoeducational model, and for all the right reasons. And it was incredibly fulfilling and exciting work. I think where it started to go sideways was when I took a job in a prison.
That seems like the beginning of a lot of movies that have maybe a rough ending. It's funny, Chris, because the conference that you spoke at, if you remember, or I'm not sure if you were there yet, because I know you had to come in and out pretty quick, but we had another presenter that I found from University of Denver, and she is she's a practicing psychologist. She is active in the military, and she runs part of their military psych program. But she used to work in a prison, and her whole presentation was on vicarious trauma. And she talks about how she had to get out of it It sounds almost identical.
Identical.
And she found herself in a university and she loves it.
Prisons themselves and running a group for abusive men can be traumatizing.
Oh,
Just
sure.
to sit in it, let alone to be a facilitator or having previous history of trauma. I mean, that can be enough to have someone go, no, thank you.
Well, and I think, too, I was working in a women's prison. So I was working with offenders, but the vast majority of my clients were victims of abusive individuals. Mm-hmm. So there was this sort of sandwich effect. I was getting the vicarious trauma of hearing about what my clients had done to their spouses, and every now and then getting a chance to talk to their spouses and hear firsthand how horrific it was. And then I go and I work in this prison where I'm seeing the long-term impact of a lot of that abuse in terms of people's mental health diagnoses. Particularly, I had, I don't know, at least a dozen clients who, if they hadn't been in a relationship with an abusive individual who was criminally oriented, they probably wouldn't have been in prison. In other words, they wouldn't have engaged in criminal activity if they weren't with somebody who was abusing them and making them essentially feel like they had no choice, which is part of what I talk about when I train folks on the impact of abuse on the brain is you get these reflexive and habitual reactions that are not necessarily connected to, who you think you are and your sense of self, because you learn to wipe that away. You don't, I had a client at the prison. Man, I'll tell you exactly what she said to me in one of our first sessions. I asked her this question of, how have things changed for you since you started that relationship with that individual and now you're here in prison? And she said, I realized when I came to prison, I didn't even know what flavor ice cream I wanted to order from the canteen, because we always ate chocolate ice cream because that was his favorite. And I just realized I don't even know what my favorite flavor of ice cream was. And that sounds so trivial in one respect, but then think about that. Think about the basic opinions that we have and the basic likes that we have, and imagine not having them and having them completely based on another person. And I think when you sit with that, you start to recognize, oh yeah, okay, I can see how it wouldn't be a step too far then to, if they start to engage you in a criminal activity, you just go along. That's you just do that. You don't question it. You don't think about it. So I think I was getting it, both working with the abusers and then working with their victims who were in prison was a double dose that was not, and prisons themselves, oh my goodness, those doors, when they slam shut, it really does have an impact. I got teary-eyed my last day when I left and I heard the doors slam shut and I realized, oh my gosh, I don't have to hear that sound again. I literally got verklempt as I was walking to my car. Like, I am so relieved.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it takes a special kind of person to do that over and over and over and over again. And this isn't just, we don't have time to get into all these really interesting areas, but the people that are working there. So we talk about the offenders that are there, but then the people that are working there, the treatment and the access to treatment and resources that they have available to them without stigma, that's probably a whole nother piece of the problem that's not being effectively addressed.
Yep.
How you recruit the people that come in there, making sure their expectations are really in line with eyes wide open of what this is actually going to be. It's again, something that we kind of talked about with Colton a little bit, and I shared from my experience of going into, when I went into federal law enforcement, I was 25, and I went into the family sexual violence unit right out of the academy, and all I was doing was child sexual assault, child pornography investigations. And within 6 months, I was like, there's no fucking way I can do this. There is no way. I was losing weight. I couldn't sleep. It was impacting me to the point that nothing has ever, nor until then nor since, and I couldn't separate from it, and I had no clue. If you were to tell me a year before I went in, if you said you're going to be in this unit, my response was, would have been, that sounds cool. I'll get the experience and I'll move into a different unit. I thought I would have been able to handle it with ease, and then realizing the reality of, oh my God, I can't do this. It's terrifying.
Yep.
And like, what are you going to do now? Like,
That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's part of the reason why I started doing evaluations. Purely, I needed an income stream. I needed a different way to make money, as opposed to working day in and day out with folks with. And I really, it sounds cliche to say, but I tip my hat to the people that can continue to do that work.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, that wasn't me. When you shared that experience about, you're doing these child sexual abuse cases, I was doing some training at the NAC, the National Advocacy Center, down in Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And, every now and then you get there early enough to listen to the presenter that's going on before you. And it was somebody who was working at the sort of federal center where they look through all the video and all the photos, and they were talking about how therapy at their workplace, therapy is mandated.
Yeah.
Their agents have to go to therapy. And I thought, A, that's brilliant. And B, I thought, oh my goodness, how do you keep people for more than like a year or two?
Yeah.
And you do, because some of the people are conditioned in a way to do it. The guy that worked with me in my office, that shared an office with me, he came from Jacksonville PD, and he was a detective doing those same cases. He signed up for it. So part of me is like, what the hell? Why would you sign up to do this? But he got such a sense of fulfillment from the justice of putting those people in prison that it made everything else worth it. And he was able to compartmentalize and look at it in a way that wasn't bringing it in emotionally as unfortunately I was doing. But it's fascinating.
I think in that, like, there's only so much like perspective shifting that you can do, because his motivation was closing the case, was getting the justice, but you can only shift your perspective so much to say this is worth it in order to stay.
I totally agree. It's a calculus that you have to run for yourself of like, just like Chris, like you were saying, is this something I can and want to continue doing? And if I can, then what do I need to change so that I can cope with this differently and in a healthy manner? If I can't, then I need to make the jump,
Yeah. The biggest barrier for me was at least in the state of Oregon, I can only speak for our state. There are, and I don't know now because I've been out of the game for a while, but at the time, there were literally a handful of psychologists who had actual experience working with abusive men. And so out of that handful of psychologists, I was the only one doing evaluations on abusive men, helping the Department of Human Services understand their dynamics, understanding, this notion that there's no correlation between personality type or MMPI scores and whether or not you've been abusive. And so the biggest barrier for me was, who's going to do these evaluations that DHS says have been critical in helping them help families if I leave? And that made it incredibly difficult. And still nobody has stepped in and filled that void. We still don't have anybody who's doing that work.
You feel almost handcuffed to it. Like if I leave, these people aren't going to get this service. Yeah, that's.
Yep. And I still to this day, I have a little bit of a pit in my stomach even saying that out loud.
When you talk about your work with abusive men, and you stepped away from it in the capacity that you were doing it for all the reasons that you had, you were very dialed in to your own emotional state, and you had this understanding that so many people cannot actually come to and then make the hard choice of actually doing something about it and changing what their profession is or how they're engaged in it. But you still, right now, currently, you're still involved in work with abusive men. Is that right?
Well, not directly, no. No, I'm
Okay.
not. I'm not seeing any abusers. I'm not working with abusive men. I'm doing trainings to help people understand the impact of abuse. And I literally just did one for the U.S. Army, where I'm part of a team that's putting together a 5-day advanced training on how to investigate domestic violence crimes.
Wow.
And so we just did our first iteration. So I'm working in the field in that way. But, part of the downside of leaving behind the clinical practice is that little smidge of imposter syndrome, because it's been a while since I've run a group. The good news is I've got colleagues, or a colleague who's still in the field, and I think he'd be the first one to say, yeah, they're still who they are.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you just said about you're involved with educating and training people on the impact of the abusive men? What do you mean by that?
Well, I think there's people have a lot of very strong opinions about how spouses of abusive individuals or intimate partners should be reacting, what they should do. And I think when they start to learn about the impact on the brain, they start to realize, oh, I might have done the same thing. I might have reacted in exactly the same way. So, this common refrain, this question of why didn't they leave? I would have never put up with that. And literally part of my training, and when I do conference work, I title the training, You'd Stay Too. Because from my perspective, it's just the brain doing what the brain does. And there's a number of psychological concepts or neuropsychological concepts about how our brains become sensitized to what is threat and what is not threat. So much around us, when we become victimized by somebody abusive, so much around us becomes threat that we find ourselves really struggling to believe that it's possible for us to exist outside of this relationship.
I know I could see questions of brewing with where Jen's head is. Go ahead.
That's a wonderful way, I think, to explain what happens in the brain. I'm curious, when you're talking about abusive men, are you referring to both like physical and psychological, verbal, mental abuse, or physical?
In fact, in my experience of running groups, right, the guys who were severely physically abusive, they usually ended up in prison, right? So they weren't coming to group. Most of my clients, the physical abuse was not nearly as significant as the psychological, emotional, financial, and what I now call it is the threat to status abuse. Because, in the past, I would have talked about the power and control wheel. Sorry, my mom was calling. Speaking of mom.
You got to take it?
No, I told her I'm going to be doing a podcast from 12:30 to 1:30. But, mom's in her 80s. She's like, hey.
She could join us.
Yeah, she could join us.
Oh, gosh. She would have some very interesting things to say, having worked with traumatized kids almost her entire career. So in the past, we would have talked about that power and control wheel, and we would have looked at, how are men abusing control. But this guy that I worked with up in Seattle, he really reframed this all in a way that I thought was brilliant. Unfortunately, I think he developed Alzheimer's before he was able to write a book about it. So one of my goals is to eventually try to get this all into writing. But he reframed the notion of power and control and talked about it from what he called organizing. And one of the reasons, and Jen, I think you'll appreciate this as a therapist, power and control has an entirely negative association. And there's that notion that when we remove a behavior, we want to be able to replace it with something. And there isn't the opposite of the power and control wheel, like the collaboration and relational wheel. But when you think about organizing as a concept is just the simple notion that it's how I let you know what I want in healthy ways and in unhealthy ways. So, think about all the healthy ways that we let people know what we want with our facial expressions and our words and our body language. And then you think about all the unhealthy ways. And so when I talk about impact on the brain, for so many survivors, their brains become sensitized to these little shifts in facial expression, in tone, in body language, in word usage that sets their defense circuitry, that elevates their defense circuitry so they become hypervigilant. This notion of I'm walking on eggshells is not just about anticipating the next abusive act. It's about day to day, their brains mapping threat constantly, and it's not always about physical threat. It's about threat to status. And the brain is using the same circuitry to react to physical threat as it is to react to threat to status. And so that notion of verbal abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, right? If we kind of circle back to where we started, it's all about threat to status. And it's activating the same defense circuitry that physical abuse is, which is why so many victims will tell you. I had a client literally in the prison who said, Chris, my broken bones always healed. I don't think my sense of self and who I am ever has. And that's all about the impact of threat to status.
Can you tell us a little more what you mean by, like, what is threat to status?
So think about all the statuses we hold as human beings in our world, right? The two of you are married, so you have status as a married couple. Engaged. The two of you are engaged, so you have status as fiancés. Yeah. Someday you may have kids, and then you have status as parents. You have jobs, so you have status as an employee. You have friends, so you have status as a friend of this person. That you have status as a son and a daughter of parents yourselves. You have status as a consumer, right? The more money you make, the more status you have as a consumer, and that is then borne out by the things that you have. And, you know, some people are really caught up in their financial status. And so they want people to know how much money they have. They, you know, and other people are like, whatever, it's no big deal. So think about all the status that a victim has and how that then gets threatened by the abuser. So, for example, saying to your spouse, you know, I really like your friends. I do. I really like your friends. But, you know, here's what I don't understand. Why don't they care about us? What do you mean? What are you talking about? Well, I mean, it feels like they just want to spend every weekend with you. And it's like, I don't get any time. And I don't understand. Like, I have a real issue with how much time your friends want to dominate. Because it feels like I know you love me, but it feels like you don't at times. In fact, I got to tell you, sometimes it fucking feels like you don't even like me, right? And so you see this manipulative piece of throwing out, I like your friends, but I don't want you to spend any time with them. And then you might even throw this raise in intensity that then starts to threaten our status as a couple by implicating your friends. That then threatens your status with your friends because I'm now saying, I don't want you to spend as much time with them. That's not fair to me. And this is something that abusive individuals, and you know, it is usually in a heterosexual relationship, it's usually men. But I think it's really important to also point out that this type of dynamic exists in any relationship. Mm-hmm. So the identified abuser will find ways to threaten status. Your status with your friends, your status with parents, for example. Well, you know what? The bottom line is if you leave, guess where that video we made last weekend is going to end up? I'm emailing it to your mom, and she's going to find out that you're a whore. I mean, I don't mean to sound so like intense, but that's the kind of stuff survivors are dealing with. Mm-hmm. Very often on a daily basis. The physical abuse is usually so intermittent, right? But this organizing and this threat to status is very often a daily occurrence, even in the midst of when things are going well.
And you never know when it's going to come up.
You never know.
So now you're on guard all of the time.
All of the time. Well, and Jen, you know about intermittent reinforcement schedules. Right. For those of you who might not be in the mental health field, if you put a rat in a cage and you put a little lever in their cage, and when they press the lever, they get a treat. If every time they press the lever, they get a treat, they will only press the lever when they want a treat. Mm-hmm. If you never give them a treat when they press the lever, they'll never press the lever. But if you give them a treat every third time, every fifth time, and then every time for a little while, the rat's going to frickin' press that lever consistently. And that's the power of that intermittent reinforcement schedule and psychological, emotional, verbal, financial abuse. It is an intermittent reinforcement schedule. So you can have a conversation with your abusive spouse, and the threat to status is not going to always be there, but it will pop up in moments that you never can expect. So like you said, Jen, you're always on alert. You're always vigilant because your brain is always mapping threat. This could go south in a hurry. So I've got to be aware.
So what's the hook? Like when you said you would stay too, like I think objectively that sounds, to anyone who's been in that situation, I'm sure they're just nodding their heads being like, that is exactly what it feels like. But to those who haven't been in it, that's where you titled that presentation that you would stay too, because it seems like, why don't you just get the hell out?
That's it.
It's just not that simple. So what is from a psychological perspective, what's the hook? Why not get out?
Without getting into the whole training, here are a couple of the hooks, right? So, threat to status very often does not feel like abuse. And you don't have to name call. You don't have to, be verbally abusive to threaten status. And even if you are verbally abusive, there are a lot of people, particularly in our society, who name calling and dropping F-bombs, it's sort of normalized. And so they don't see themselves as victims. I mean, I literally had a client who I worked with in my individual private practice who only came to therapy because I was doing a training for a shelter, for all the volunteers at a shelter, and she was one of the volunteers. And when I started doing this talk, she was like, "Oh my God, you're describing my husband." I had no idea. He was physically abusive one time early on in their dating life. And then they were married. They'd been married for 27 years. Wow. She was in her 50s. So one of the hooks is, if the abuse has been threat to status throughout the course of your relationship, then you're very likely not going to see yourself as a victim. And you'd stay too. If you don't see yourself as a victim, there's no way you're leaving. Right? And then another piece of this is what I call shark and dolphin. So abusers are absolutely fabulous as portraying themselves to everybody outside the family. In particular, there's about 50% of abusers are only abusive in the context of the family. And to everybody else, they look normal, they look healthy, they look nice, they look like dolphins. Inside the family, to their spouses, they're sharks. So part of what happens is, I, as a survivor, I go to disclose to my parents, to my best friend, and I'm met with things like, "Well, gosh, are you? Are you sure? Did he mean to say that, or did they? Are you sure that? What's your part in this, or are you sure we're talking about the same person? Because we've known each other a long time. Jim's been over to our house, or." And I'm just having a really hard time seeing this. These are all things that have literally been said to clients of mine that I work with. And what happens then is, you heard me earlier, we talked about this self-blame piece that victims of trauma do. Somebody who's been verbally, psychologically, financially abused, when they start to hear that everybody else sees their partner as a dolphin, they say, well, it must be my fault then. Because they don't want to see their partner as a shark. They're like, well, I definitely see my partner as a dolphin, and so I must be doing things to turn my partner into a shark. And if you see yourself as being responsible for turning your partner into an abusive individual, you absolutely would stay because you start to believe, well, if I can just change the way I interact, if I can change the things I do. I have a colleague of mine who was abused by her both intimate partner and then trafficked by that person. And she used to carry a list of things that she thought she needed to avoid doing so that he would avoid being abusive to her.
My God.
So those are some of the hooks. I think the last one I'll mention is this. The attachment is real. It drives me bonkers when I hear people refer to abusive individuals and their relationships with the victims as a trauma bond. It's not a trauma bond. That completely misrepresents. A trauma bond is if all three of us are in a bank making a deposit and the bank gets robbed. And the three of us, we are now in this hostage-taking situation. And we've never met, but we all start talking. And we form this bond around the trauma. That's a trauma bond. So the attachment, the bond that an abuser has to the victim is a very real bond that starts when they first meet. Because abusive individuals don't enter the relationship and go, hi, I'm Chris. I'm abusive. I'll be abusing you for the next, I'm really looking forward to. No, they say, I'm a dolphin. I'm a dolphin. I'm a dolphin. Right?
That'd be nice.
Right? Because they know that. And having worked with these guys, I'll tell you, every one of them's like, well, of course I'm not going to act that way at the outset of the relationship. Nobody would continue to go out with me. Right? So this is that, the last dynamic I'll bring up, that notion of the attachment is real and the good moments are real, and you can't ignore that and expect somebody to go, oh, I'm staying with I've been with an abusive individual for 10 years and so I better leave. I don't think you understand. My partner isn't that way all the time. And you may even hear, well, they're trying to change. They're going to treatment. Right. And if so, these are the kinds of things that you tell yourself, you absolutely would stay. So those are some of the hooks.
Yeah. And that intermittent reinforcement that you mentioned too is, well, it's not bad all of the time. Like, well, hold on, I can hold on to these good moments. And maybe if I act this way, I can get more of those good moments. And then those bad moments will go away because now I've taken full responsibility for how this person is treating me.
And God forbid you've gone to a couples therapist who doesn't get it.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Are couples therapists, I would imagine, like they're good ones are trained to spot this and how they present it in a way. Because if you tell the abuser, listen, you're the problem, you're the abuser, he's going to be like, we're not fucking going back to that therapist.
You got that right.
So there must be like a very sensitive and strategic way to introduce you are actually the problem without saying you are in fact the problem.
Yeah, the most skillful couples therapists will see it like alcoholism. And so you don't go to couples therapy to deal with your alcoholism. That's work you need to do on your own, right? And so they'll frame the behavior that the abuser engages in and say, look, this behavior that you're engaged in, if we think about it in the same way we think about alcoholism, it's behavior that in order for you to change, you need to focus on it just yourself. And I have some referrals. I would like you to go talk to, one of these three people about that. And then people that work with abusive individuals are usually really good at helping them recognize that they have to be in a group. Because a lot of these folks are so defensive and in denial, and they minimize that they can even, I considered myself a highly competent, highly trained, talented therapist. And my clients, if I had tried to work with them individually, would have spun me around a million times over. So what they need is other guys in the group who help hold them accountable and say, Larry, I appreciate you saying that you don't really belong here, but guess what all of us said when we first came to this group? The exact same thing. So hang in there, man. Hang in there. Or things like, Larry, when you said all I did was, That's minimizing, man. All you did was put your hand on her neck. Do you hear yourself? That comes from the therapist. Huge threat to status for the client. That comes from another client. It doesn't seem to be as intensely a threat to status. It seems to be more like a, hey, we want you to have what's best for you. We want you to have a good life like we want to have. And are you seeing what we're seeing?
Yeah. It's almost like a peer, a teacher versus a peer.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the therapist's job is to try to help that group be a healthy group where the group members are holding each other accountable. When group members aren't holding each other accountable, you are putting in a good night's work as the therapist, because you are then having to do a lot of what's called bridging, where you would say, Tony, what do you think's going on with Barry right now? And if Tony doesn't get it, Ralph, what do you think's going on with Tony? Right. And so you're constantly doing this, attempting to build relationships between the people in the group so that they eventually then can hold each other accountable. And it's incredible. It's both exhilarating and it's exhausting.
Sounds, yeah.
Well, I've always viewed group work and couples or family therapy as it's an art. I am a baby therapist. I'm not fully licensed, and I was always avoidant of doing couples work because I know how impactful and important it can be, and I am not trained in that. So I was never comfortable taking on a couple. There's so many dynamics in the room. There's so many needs, and it's so complex that I actually would not take on a couple. It's not something that I'm trained in. It's not something that I would be comfortable doing. And ethically, for couples, if abuse is suspected, that stops. The couples therapy stops. Now you're both going to go to individual. Maybe we can reconvene later, but it's almost like replaying abuse if we're continuing a couples counseling session with an abuser in the room because of that minimizing, rationalizing, over justifying. It's reinforcing to the abused person that now I have a professional in front of me that's allowing this to happen, so it must be okay. And
that's incredibly traumatizing, as you can imagine, right? And you know what's fascinating about this? This whole movement sort of started in the 70s with these two researchers called Strauss and Gellis, and they did this enormous study that said women are being physically abused in heterosexual relationships, right? Huge hetero bias for the first, I would say at least 20 to 30 years of the research into this abuse dynamic. And so you had sort of the alarms go off, and people were like, oh my gosh, we need to do this. And you see shelters, the rise of shelters comes up. And just sort of as an aside, one of the most fascinating statistics that you see shift as the shelter movement. Whoa.
Yes. I was waiting for it. I didn't think it would happen on the Riverside.
What happened?
That's awesome. I didn't even do a thumbs up.
He's got this thing. We found it on a call with Colton maybe 2 months ago, but he put his thumbs up, and I think it did a bunch of thumbs.
But I didn't. Did I do thumbs up?
I think maybe you put your hands up.
So what happened was the country, you saw this rise in the shelter network. And the most fascinating statistic is you did not see a drop in the rate of women being murdered by their spouses when the shelter network came into play. You saw a decrease in the number of men being murdered by their spouses. Wow. Because the victims were able to get to safety and didn't have to then do what they thought they had to do in terms of murder. It's a fascinating when you look at that correlation and you see those numbers drop. So what I'm getting to is this. Eventually, people started to do more research into the field, and they came up with this statistic that men and women in hetero relationships are equally abusive. And a bunch of people went, what are you talking about? That is not true. That's just, so this guy named Michael Johnson out of Penn State who's actually a sociologist, said, I think I can make some sense of this. And he drew a distinction between sort of the traditional domestic violence when we think about it and something he called situational couples violence. Situational couples violence is when, I call it the New York couple, right? I get home and I'm like, how the fuck were you? How the fuck am I? How the fuck me, fuck you. And they get into this argument. But then, by 10 o'clock, they're like watching a movie together and right. And so situational couples violence is more about an inability to manage conflict, an inability to manage emotion. There may be like substance use issues in there. Like maybe you've had a little too much to drink, but there's no pattern of power and control or organizing. There's no pattern of fear that the victim feels. Like when I've interviewed and done evals on couples where it truly is situational couples violence, you ask the person who's the suspected victim, like, are you afraid of your partner? And you hear things like, and this is literally a quote from one of the former, like, oh God, no, if anything, my husband should be afraid of me. So I think what has happened is a lot of couples therapists, a lot of judges, a lot of attorneys, they hear this term situational couples violence, and it's so much easier to think, oh, this is just like a high conflict couple. I can work with them. And so from a couples therapy perspective, you've got all these therapists out there that, from my perspective, they think they can do this work because they are erroneously labeling it as this situational abuse as opposed to it's connected to this much deeper pattern. They've gone to a training. They've heard about situational couples violence. I mean, unfortunately, I and a colleague of mine who works at a hospital where she sees lots of clients on a short term. She does a lot of short term connecting to other resources. She's like, Chris, it is pervasive. The number of victims of domestic violence I see who talk about horrific experiences in couples therapy because the couples therapist thought that they were seeing something they weren't seeing.
I can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah.
The just because I want to be respectful of the time that you've got here, Chris, and I did want to make sure that we can cover at least one other topic, which is the book that you're currently working on, which I think is a good kind of segue. Can you talk a little bit about what that book is and kind of what it's focused on?
Yeah, so I came up with, when I was doing this work with abusive guys, you would get to this place with them where they would want to know, how can I start to heal the relationship with my spouse if their partner stayed with them? And so we would have these conversations about you can't just say I'm sorry, because so many of these guys would say I'm sorry that I hurt you, I'm sorry that I did this, and then it's like, I said I'm sorry. Why are we still talking about it? Like, don't you believe me? And so I came up with what I called the 4 steps to apology. The 4th step, which I think is the most unique piece, and the first step is you have to be fully accountable. So no minimizing, no blaming, no denying. And that's right out of the Duluth Power and Control Wheel. And the second step is you have to express an awareness of impact. Because so many folks, and from my perspective, we're now getting out of just working with abusive men, and we're just human beings in general. When I apologize, I want the person I'm apologizing to know that I didn't mean it. And whenever I focus on my intent and I don't talk about impact, I'm basically saying, yeah, I mean, I know you were hurt and everything, but I didn't mean it. And so the person who's being apologized to experiences this minimization of their own personal experience. So from my perspective, we have to be fully accountable. The second step is we have to express an awareness of impact, and we have to let ourselves be coached by whoever it is that we're apologizing to. We have to be open to them correcting us and saying, well, no, I wasn't frustrated. I was fucking pissed off. Like, okay. Right. So, and then the third step is we have to express an awareness of the impact on ourselves, which is regret. And if the impact on yourself was not that you felt regret, then why are you apologizing in the first place? If that, if that makes sense. And then the last step, and the one that I think is really cool, is the notion of you have to say to the person that you're apologizing to, I have thought about what led me to doing this in terms of my own dynamics and like who I am. If at some point you ever want to talk about that, I'm open to that. I don't want to put that on you now, because that can sound too much like I'm trying to minimize the impact. But if you're ever interested in that, I'm open to that. And quite honestly, if you ever want to talk about what has gone on between the two of us and how we got to this point of me acting in the way I acted, and when I say we, I'm meaning like how did I get to that place, I'm totally open to it. And that fourth step is one that, from my perspective, in any relationship is so beautiful. And really the reason I wrote the book is because a friend of mine, a dear friend of mine, a guy who I've been composing music with for, going on like more than 10 years. We were hanging out one night and he was talking about a disagreement that he and his wife had, and it stemmed from a camping trip, and he had played poker and stayed up all night and not come to bed in the tent and snuggled with her, which was like one of her favorite things to do. And she kept bringing it up, and he kept saying, I'm sorry. Like, I really am sorry. And so I said to him, man, yeah, I've never told you about these 4 steps, but I think you're missing that 4th step. And this light bulb went off. And so he went home and he talked to her about how he totally got it, that at the beginning of their marriage, he wasn't really ready to be married. And so he was sort of still doing single guy stuff. Mm-hmm. And she felt like, what the fuck, dude? Are you with me or are you not? Because you just keep going out and doing things with other people, and like you're not invested in the household. And he was like, look, I get it that when I acted that way, it probably brought up a bunch of your memories of when we were first married. And that's like, whoa, if that happened, I totally get it. And I want you to know I'm aware, and I'm working really hard at I don't want you to think I'm like backsliding. And he said she just broke out and was like, oh my, yes, you get it. Like, and he said, we've never talked about it since. We're closer than we ever have been. He was like, you need to write this. This needs to be a freaking book. And that's literally when I decided, oh, maybe it would be helpful, because he's not abusive at all, right? He's not an abusive guy. Yeah. But from a relationship perspective, I mean, you think about a conflict, how often do we talk about why we did what we did in terms of ourselves? And then talk about what we're doing to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. That's that piece, Jen, when I mentioned, instead of saying, I'm going to not do it again, why? What are you doing to try to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Tell Us More About That. Don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform it is that you're listening to us on, and also leave us a rating and review.
If you have any topics you would like us to consider, if you have any feedback or commentary, only if it's positive, please visit www.tellusmoreaboutthat.com.
Thanks again for joining in, and we will see you next time.
See ya.